The morning coffee had grown cold in Lourdes Cooper's weathered hands as she stared at the television screen, watching news footage of the massive wildfire consuming the mountains above Riverside County, California. At 74, with silver hair tucked beneath a faded baseball cap and reading glasses perched on her nose, she looked like any other grandmother spending her Tuesday morning in the common room of Sunset Gardens assisted living community. But as the news reporter described the desperate evacuation efforts and the shortage of qualified helicopter pilots, something flickered behind Lourdes's tired eyes, something that hadn't been there in decades. "Terrible tragedy," murmured Helen Martinez, the facility's activities coordinator, settling into the chair beside Lourdes. "They're saying the fire jumped 3 ridgelines overnight. 80 elderly residents are trapped at Mountain View Care Center, and they can't get the helicopters in because of the wind conditions. Such a shame." Lourdes nodded absently, her fingers unconsciously gripping the armrest of her chair as she watched the aerial footage of smoke-filled canyons and impossible terrain. What Helen couldn't see was how those same fingers had once controlled the cyclic stick of a UH-1 Huey helicopter through far worse conditions, navigating hostile territory where one wrong move meant death for everyone aboard. "I could get them out," Lourdes whispered, so quietly that Helen almost missed it. "What's that, dear?" But Lourdes was already reaching for her phone, her mind calculating wind patterns and approach angles with the precision of someone whose knowledge had been earned through fire and blood in the skies over Southeast Asia. "Half a century ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." 3 hours later, Lourdes Cooper stood at the security checkpoint of Riverside County Emergency Operations Center, clutching a visitor's badge and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Her arthritis-stiffened joints protested the early morning drive from the assisted living facility, and her simple cardigan and comfortable walking shoes made her feel invisible among the uniformed emergency responders rushing past with urgent purpose. The operations center buzzed with controlled chaos as the Clearwater fire, now consuming over 15,000 acres, threatened to become the worst natural disaster in the county's history. Weather conditions had grounded most aircraft, leaving ground crews struggling to reach isolated communities cut off by walls of flame and smoke. "Ma'am, can I help you?" asked Officer Janet Rodriguez, barely glancing up from her incident reports as Lourdes approached the information desk. Her tone carried the practiced patience of someone accustomed to dealing with concerned citizens who wanted to help but had little to offer beyond good intentions. "I'm here about the Mountain View Care Center evacuation," Lourdes replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I understand you're having difficulty with helicopter operations in the current conditions." Rodriguez looked up with mild curiosity, taking in Lourdes's grandmother appearance and probably wondering what advice a civilian could possibly offer about complex aerial rescue operations. "The situation is being handled by our emergency aviation unit, ma'am. If you're concerned about someone at the facility, we have family notification procedures." "I'm not here as family," Lourdes interrupted gently. "I'm here as a pilot." The silence that followed was awkward rather than surprised. Rodriguez's expression shifted to the careful politeness reserved for elderly citizens who might be experiencing confusion or delusions of capability around them. The constant chatter of radio communications continued as incident commanders coordinated resources for a disaster that was growing worse by the hour. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but helicopter rescue operations require specialized training and current certifications that take years to achieve," Rodriguez explained with professional kindness. "Our pilots are dealing with extreme wind conditions and zero visibility situations that challenge even the most experienced aviators." Lourdes reached into her purse and produced a worn leather wallet, extracting a pilot's license that had been renewed faithfully for over 5 decades. The document looked authentic enough, though Rodriguez noted the birth date that would make this woman nearly 75 years old, well beyond the age when most pilots maintained active flying status. Mrs. Cooper, while I'm sure you have flying experience, this situation requires pilots with current emergency operations training. Rodriguez continued, her tone growing slightly firmer. The conditions out there are beyond what civilian pilots typically encounter. What Rodriguez couldn't know was that the seemingly fragile woman standing before her had logged over 3,000 combat flight hours in Vietnam, flying medical evacuations, through conditions that made today's wildfire look like a training exercise. Lourdes had navigated through enemy fire, tropical storms, and mechanical failures that would have killed lesser pilots, bringing wounded soldiers home when everyone else said it was impossible. But that history lived in classified military records that Lourdes had never discussed, even with her own family. Her service as one of the first female helicopter pilots in active combat had been buried beneath decades of bureaucratic secrecy and cultural assumptions about what women could accomplish in military aviation. "I understand your concerns, officer Rodriguez," Lourdes said quietly. "Perhaps I could speak with your incident commander about the specific challenges you're facing with the current weather patterns." Rodriguez hesitated, clearly torn between dismissing what seemed like an elderly citizen's well-meaning but unrealistic offer and the professional obligation to explore every possible resource during an emergency. The Mountain View Care Center situation was becoming desperate, with 80 elderly residents trapped in a facility that ground crews couldn't reach through the advancing fire lines. "Let me check with Captain Morrison," Rodriguez finally decided. "He's coordinating the aviation response. But I have to warn you, Mrs. Cooper, they're dealing with wind gusts over 60 miles per hour and visibility that drops to zero without warning. This isn't recreational flying." As Rodriguez made the call, Lourdes studied the large situation map that dominated one wall of the operations center. Her trained eye analyzed the topography, wind patterns, and fire pressure with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years reading similar maps under life-or-death circumstances. She could see why the current pilots were struggling. The approach to Mountain View required threading through a canyon system, where winds would create dangerous downdrafts and the smoke would eliminate visual references. But she could also see a route that the younger pilots had missed, one that would use the wind patterns instead of fighting them, approaching from the northeast where the ridgeline would provide protection from the worst turbulence. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had kept her alive in Vietnam, where conventional approaches got people killed. Captain Mike Morrison emerged from the communications room, looking like a man who had been awake for 36 hours straight, which he had. His flight suit bore the patches of a veteran pilot, but his haggard expression revealed someone pushed beyond normal operational limits by an emergency that kept escalating beyond their resources. "Mrs. Cooper, Officer Rodriguez tells me you have helicopter experience and want to help with the Mountain View situation," Morrison said, his tone walking the line between professional courtesy and barely concealed skepticism. "I appreciate civilian pilots who want to contribute during emergencies, but I have to be honest, the conditions out there are extreme, even by our standards." Lourdes nodded with appropriate humility while mentally noting that Morrison's bearing suggested someone competent but inexperienced with the specific type of crisis they were facing. His confidence appeared to be built on normal emergency operations rather than the improvised problem-solving required when standard procedures failed. "Captain Morrison, I'd like to understand the specific challenges your pilots are encountering," she replied. "Sometimes an outside perspective can identify alternatives that weren't immediately obvious." Morrison gestured toward the weather display showing real-time conditions from the fire zone. Wind speeds fluctuated wildly as thermal columns created by the fire interacted with the natural canyon winds, creating a chaotic atmospheric environment that defeated normal flying techniques. "Our biggest problem is wind shear in the approach corridor," Morrison explained. We've got gusts hitting 70 miles per hour with direction changes that can flip an aircraft in seconds. Add smoke that reduces visibility to zero, and we're looking at conditions that exceed safe operational parameters for any helicopter. What about approach routes from the northeast? Lourdes asked, studying the topographical display with obvious familiarity. The ridgeline there might provide wind shadow that would reduce turbulence. Morrison's expression shifted slightly, as he realized that Lourdes's question demonstrated more technical understanding than he had expected from a civilian pilot. Her suggestion about wind shadow effects showed knowledge of mountain flying techniques that weren't commonly known outside professional aviation circles. The northeast approach is blocked by the main fire line, Morrison replied, though his tone had become more respectful. Even if we could get through the smoke, the thermal activity from the fire creates unpredictable updrafts that could overwhelm aircraft control systems. Lourdes studied the fire progression map more carefully, her mind automatically calculating the thermal patterns and wind interactions that the younger pilots were seeing as obstacles rather than opportunities. In Vietnam, she had learned to use environmental conditions that other pilots avoided, turning apparent disadvantages into tactical advantages. "Captain, what's the timeline for evacuation?" she asked. "How long before ground access becomes completely impossible?" Morrison's expression grew grim as he consulted the latest projections from the fire behavior analysts. Current models show the fire reaching Mountain View's perimeter in approximately 4 hours. After that, the facility will be completely surrounded, and the heat intensity will make any rescue attempt impossible. The weight of that timeline settled over everyone present. 80 elderly residents faced certain death unless someone could solve the aerial access problem that had stumped the county's most experienced emergency pilots. The conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done safely, but conventional wisdom had never encountered someone with Lourdes Cooper's unique combination of skills and experience. As the morning progressed, Lourdes listened to radio communications from the failed rescue attempts, each one confirming what she already knew. The pilots were fighting the environmental conditions instead of working with them. Their training had taught them to avoid the exact circumstances that Lourdes had learned to exploit during her combat service. The irony was profound and familiar. Once again, she found herself in a situation where her capabilities were being dismissed based on appearances rather than qualifications, while people died because the right expertise wasn't being recognized or utilized. The patterns of bureaucratic blindness that had limited her military career were playing out again, but this time the stakes involved civilian lives rather than military objectives. But unlike her younger years, when she had been forced to accept other people's limitations on her capabilities, Lourdes now possessed something that no bureaucracy could dismiss or regulate: the absolute certainty that comes from having already accomplished the impossible when everything depended on getting it right. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Riverside County Fire Department's hangar facility buzzed with frustrated energy as Lourdes Cooper arrived the following morning, officially registered as a civilian aviation consultant through a bureaucratic process that had taken Officer Rodriguez most of the previous evening to arrange. The designation was largely meaningless, but it provided Lourdes with legitimate access to observe the ongoing rescue operations and, more importantly, to investigate why experienced pilots were failing at a mission she knew was achievable. Chief Flight Instructor David Chen stood before a group of exhausted pilots, pointing at weather charts that painted an increasingly dire picture of the conditions surrounding Mountain View Care Center. His 23 years of emergency aviation experience had never prepared him for the combination of factors that were defeating every rescue attempt. "Third abort in 12 hours, Chen announced to the assembled crew, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose professional confidence was being systematically destroyed. Lieutenant Sarah Williams came within 800 meters of the landing zone before wind shear forced emergency pullback. Current conditions show no improvement for the next 18 hours. Lourdes positioned herself unobtrusively near the back of the briefing area, her notebook and reading glasses reinforcing her appearance as someone documenting procedures rather than evaluating them. What she observed during the next hour revealed problems that went far beyond challenging weather conditions. The pilots were competent and well-trained, according to current emergency response standards, but their techniques reflected peacetime assumptions about risk management that became liabilities when facing truly extreme conditions. They were flying defensive patterns designed to minimize danger rather than offensive approaches that accepted calculated risks to achieve mission success. Lieutenant Williams, a skilled aviator with over 1,200 flight hours, described her aborted approach with professional precision that masked underlying frustration. Visibility dropped to absolute zero at 400 feet altitude, she reported. Wind shear indicators showed conditions exceeding safe operational parameters, and standard procedure required immediate abort. Lourdes made careful notes while suppressing the urge to explain that safe operational parameters were peacetime luxuries that disappeared when lives hung in the balance. In Vietnam, she had completed successful evacuations under conditions that would have triggered automatic aborts according to current regulations. But those missions had been guided by different priorities than bureaucratic risk management. The code problem became clearer as Lourdes listened to detailed accounts of each failed attempt. The pilots were following textbook procedures that worked perfectly for normal emergency operations, but were inadequate for the extreme conditions created by the wildfire. Their training had prepared them to avoid dangerous situations rather than navigate through them when avoidance meant accepting mission failure. Flight mechanic Roberto Martinez approached Lourdes during a break in the briefing, his expression combining professional curiosity with the kind of respect that experienced maintenance personnel reserved for anyone who demonstrated genuine interest in aircraft systems. Mrs. Cooper, Chief Chun mentioned you have helicopter experience, Martinez said. What's your assessment of our operational challenges? The question provided Lourdes with an opportunity to probe deeper into the technical aspects of the rescue failures without revealing the true extent of her expertise. Her investigation needed to identify whether the problems were primarily environmental, mechanical, or procedural before she could propose solutions that wouldn't immediately trigger skepticism about her capabilities. Mr. Martinez, I'm curious about the specific aircraft configurations being used for these attempts, she replied. Are the helicopters equipped with enhanced navigation systems for zero visibility operations? Martinez's response revealed the first significant weakness in the current rescue approach. The county's emergency helicopters were equipped with standard civilian navigation equipment that relied heavily on visual references and GPS systems that could be compromised by the electromagnetic interference generated by large fires. We've got basic instrument packages, but nothing designed for military-style operations in hostile environments, Martinez explained. The smoke and thermal activity from the fire are playing havoc with our electronic systems, and the pilots are having to rely on visual navigation techniques that become impossible when visibility drops to zero. Lourdes nodded thoughtfully while mentally noting that the navigation challenges would be easily overcome using techniques she had developed during night evacuations in Southeast Asia, where electronic systems were primitive and enemy fire made standard approaches suicidal. The current problems were severe, but far from insurmountable with the right tactical approach. What about alternative landing sites? She asked. Has anyone evaluated approaches that might avoid the worst of the wind shear patterns? Martinez's expression suggested that Lourdes had identified another weakness in the current planning. The incident commanders had been focused on direct approaches to the facility's main helicopter pad, he admitted. Alternative sites would require ground coordination that might not be possible with current communication blackouts. The communication problem represented the kind of systemic failure that Lourdes recognized from her military experience. The rescue attempts were being planned and executed using peacetime assumptions about coordination and support that broke down completely under extreme conditions. Successful combat operations required redundant systems and tactical flexibility that civilian emergency services rarely developed. During lunch break, Lourdes managed to examine the actual aircraft that would be used for any successful rescue mission. The Bell 412 helicopter was a capable aircraft with adequate power and payload capacity for the mission requirements, but its configuration reflected civilian priorities rather than the combat-oriented modifications that would optimize performance under extreme conditions. "She's a good bird," commented pilot James Anderson, joining Lourdes as she studied the aircraft specifications. "Reliable, powerful enough for heavy loads, and stable in normal weather conditions. But these aren't normal conditions." Anderson's 20-year career in emergency aviation had included disasters, ranging from earthquake rescues to offshore oil rig evacuations, but his experience had never encompassed the unique challenges posed by wildfire conditions combined with the time pressure of trapped civilians facing certain death. "The thermal activity is unlike anything we've trained for," Anderson continued. "Updrafts that can lift an aircraft 500 feet in seconds, followed by downdrafts that slam you toward the ground before you can react. At zero visibility and winds that change direction without warning, and you're dealing with conditions that exceed human capabilities." Lourdes listened with growing understanding of why the rescue attempts were failing. Anderson and his colleagues were exceptional pilots operating within the limitations of their training and experience, but those limitations were becoming death sentences for the trapped residents at Mountain View Care Center. The afternoon brought more failed rescue attempts as conditions continued to deteriorate around the fire zone. Each abort was professionally executed and entirely justifiable according to civilian aviation safety standards, but the cumulative effect was a growing sense of helplessness as time ran out for the trapped residents. Weather Officer Lisa Thompson provided updates that confirmed what everyone already knew: the environmental conditions were worsening rather than improving, and the window for successful evacuation was closing rapidly. Current projections showed the fire reaching Mountain View's perimeter within 36 hours, after which rescue would become impossible regardless of pilot skill or aircraft capability. "Thermal activity is increasing as the fire spreads," Thompson reported during the evening briefing. "Wind patterns are becoming more chaotic, and smoke density is reducing visibility to zero throughout the target area. Current weather models show no improvement for the next 48 hours. The silence that followed Thompson's report was profound and desperate. Every person in the briefing room understood that 80 innocent people were facing death, because professional aviation expertise was proving insufficient for the rescue mission that their survival required. Chief Chun dismissed the meeting with the weary frustration of someone whose professional competence was being challenged by circumstances beyond his control. As the pilots filed out, their expressions reflected the particular agony that comes with knowing that people will die because of problems you cannot solve. Lourdes remained behind, ostensibly organizing her consultation notes while actually processing the information she had gathered during her investigation. The technical challenges were significant but manageable with the right approach. The real obstacles were bureaucratic and cultural. The civilian aviation community was constrained by safety regulations and risk management protocols that were appropriate for normal operations but became counterproductive during extreme emergencies. Her investigation had revealed that successful rescue would require someone willing to use techniques that violated standard procedures, accepting risks that civilian pilots were trained to avoid, and operating with the kind of tactical flexibility that existed only in military aviation circles. The irony was bitter and familiar. Once again, Lourdes found herself in possession of exactly the expertise needed to save lives, while being systematically excluded from the decision-making process, because her capabilities weren't recognized or understood by the people in authority. But, unlike her earlier military career, when she had been forced to accept limitations imposed by others, Lourdes now possessed something that bureaucracy couldn't regulate or dismiss: the absolute determination that comes from knowing that 80 innocent people will die unless someone steps forward to do what others believe is impossible. The investigation phase was complete. Tomorrow would bring the crisis that would force her hand and reveal whether 5 decades of hidden expertise could overcome the institutional blindness that was sentencing good people to death. The emergency phone call came at 3:47 a.m. Jarring. Lourdes Cooper from restless sleep in her assisted living apartment. Helen Martinez's voice carried a panic that cut through the early morning darkness like a blade. "Lourdes, are you watching the news? Mountain View Care Center. The situation has gotten much worse." Lourdes fumbled for the television remote, her arthritis-stiffened fingers struggling with the small buttons as she tried to process Helen's fragmented updates. When the local news feed finally appeared on screen, the images that greeted her were apocalyptic in their intensity. The Clearwater fire had exploded overnight, consuming an additional 8,000 acres, in a phenomenon that fire behavior specialists were calling unprecedented. Winds exceeding 80 miles per hour had driven the flames across 3 major fire breaks that were supposed to contain the blaze, creating a wall of destruction that now surrounded Mountain View Care Center on 3 sides. "We're going to live coverage from Channel 7's helicopter," announced news anchor Patricia Wells, her professional composure barely concealing the gravity of what she was about to report. "But we want to warn viewers that the images you're about to see are extremely disturbing." The aerial footage revealed a scene that looked more like a war zone than a California mountainside. Mountain View Care Center sat isolated in a clearing that was rapidly shrinking as flames advanced from multiple directions. The facility's emergency generators provided the only lights visible through the dense smoke, creating an island of civilization that was about to be consumed by a natural disaster of biblical proportions. What made the situation even more desperate was new information from facility administrator Carol Jenkins, whose radio communications with emergency services painted a picture of mounting crisis inside the trapped building. "We have 14 residents on life support systems that cannot be moved without medical helicopters," Jenkins reported, her voice crackling through static that made every word precious. "Oxygen supplies are running critically low due to smoke infiltration, and several residents are experiencing respiratory distress that requires immediate evacuation to specialized medical facilities." Lourdes dressed quickly, her mind already calculating the tactical implications of what she had just learned. The rescue mission had transformed from difficult to nearly impossible overnight, but the medical emergency created by smoke infiltration meant that time was no longer measured in hours, but in minutes. The drive to Riverside County Emergency Operations Center took her through neighborhoods where ash fell like snow and the air quality had deteriorated to levels that triggered health warnings for the entire region. Emergency vehicles raced past her modest sedan with sirens wailing, all heading toward a disaster that was growing faster than anyone could respond. Operations Center, when she arrived, was a study in controlled desperation. Personnel who had been working around the clock for 3 days moved with the mechanical precision of people functioning on adrenaline and professional duty, rather than adequate rest. Maps that had shown manageable fire boundaries 12 hours earlier now displayed a catastrophe that threatened to overwhelm every resource in Southern California. Chief Fire Officer Michael Rodriguez, no relation to the security officer who had first dismissed Lourdes, stood before a room packed with emergency personnel, delivering updates that sounded more like wartime intelligence briefings than civilian disaster reports. "Current fire perimeter has Mountain View completely surrounded," Rodriguez announced, pointing to a digital display that showed the care center as a small blue dot in an ocean of red danger zones. Ground access is impossible due to bridge collapses and road conditions that would be fatal for emergency vehicles. Air access remains our only option, but weather conditions continue to exceed safe operational parameters for all available aircraft. Captain Morrison, whom Lourdes had met during her initial visit, looked like a man who had aged years in the past few days. His reports on aviation resources painted a picture of systematic failure that was becoming more desperate with each passing hour. "We've attempted 17 separate rescue approaches in the past 36 hours, Morrison reported to the assembled emergency coordinators. Every attempt has been aborted due to wind shear, zero visibility, or thermal activity that exceeds aircraft structural limits. Our most experienced pilots are unanimous in their assessment that the mission cannot be completed using standard emergency aviation procedures." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone present understood that standard emergency aviation procedures represented the absolute limit of what civilian rescue services could accomplish. When those procedures failed, there were no alternatives except to accept that some disasters exceeded human capabilities to respond. But Lourdes knew something that nobody else in the room understood: standard procedures were designed for normal emergencies, not for the kind of extreme conditions that required military-style tactical aviation. The mission wasn't impossible. It simply required techniques that civilian pilots weren't trained to use, and regulations didn't permit them to attempt. Weather specialist Dr. Amanda Foster provided the technical analysis that confirmed everyone's worst fears about the deteriorating conditions around Mountain View Care Center. Her computer model showed atmospheric conditions that resembled hurricane-force storms, combined with the thermal chaos of volcanic eruptions. Wind shear patterns are now fluctuating between 40 and 95 miles per hour, with direction changes occurring every 15 to 30 seconds. Dr. Foster explained, her scientific precision making the data even more terrifying. Thermal columns generated by the fire are creating vertical air movements exceeding 3,000 feet per minute, which would overwhelm the control systems of any helicopter attempting to maintain stable flight. The silence that followed Dr. Foster's briefing was broken by a new voice, someone whose presence Lourdes hadn't noticed during her previous visits to the operations center. Dr. Richard Hamilton wore the uniform of a military flight surgeon, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been monitoring the medical situation at Mountain View through radio communications with their nursing staff," Dr. Hamilton announced. "Based on current conditions inside the facility, I estimate that we have approximately 6 hours before smoke-related respiratory failures begin claiming lives among the most vulnerable residents." 6 hours. The timeline that had seemed impossibly short suddenly became even more desperate as medical realities combined with environmental conditions to create a crisis that was spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. Chief Rodriguez called for a 5-minute break, during which small groups of emergency personnel huddled in whispered conversations that all reached the same conclusion: 80 people were going to die because the rescue mission exceeded current capabilities. Lourdes used the break to approach Captain Morrison, who stood alone studying weather displays with the expression of someone desperately searching for alternatives that didn't exist. "Captain Morrison, I've been reviewing the approach patterns your pilots have been attempting," she said quietly, her voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been present during their earlier conversations. "I believe there might be tactical alternatives that haven't been considered." Morrison turned toward her with the weary patience of someone who had exhausted every possibility and wasn't interested in well-meaning suggestions from civilian observers. "Mrs. Cooper, I appreciate your concern, but we've consulted with every aviation expert on the West Coast. The conditions out there are beyond what any helicopter can handle safely. Captain, What if safety margins weren't the primary consideration? Lourdes asked, her question carrying implications that made Morrison pause in his dismissive response. What if someone was willing to accept risks that normal procedures wouldn't permit? The question hung between them like a challenge to everything that civilian emergency aviation represented. Morrison stared at her for a long moment, processing the possibility that this elderly woman might be suggesting something that went far beyond standard emergency procedures. Mrs. Cooper, are you talking about a suicide mission? Morrison asked, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. Because that's what you're describing, flying conditions that would almost certainly result in aircraft loss and crew fatalities. Lourdes met his stare with steady determination that seemed to come from decades of experience that Morrison couldn't begin to imagine. Captain, I'm talking about a rescue mission flown by someone who understands the difference between unacceptable risk and calculated risk under extreme conditions. Before Morrison could respond, the break ended and Chief Rodriguez called everyone back to attention for what would become the final briefing before the situation became completely hopeless. Based on current fire progression and medical reports from Mountain View, we have reached the point where continued rescue attempts may cost additional lives without saving the people we're trying to help, Rodriguez announced, his words carrying the weight of a man admitting professional defeat. Unless someone has alternatives that haven't been considered, we may need to accept that this disaster has exceeded our response capabilities. The moment had arrived when Lourdes would either step forward and reveal decades of hidden expertise, or watch 80 innocent people die, because bureaucracy and assumptions had prevented the right person from being in the right place when lives depended on exceptional capabilities. In the silence that followed Rodriguez's admission of defeat, every eye in the room turned toward sources of hope that didn't exist, except for one elderly woman whose true qualifications remained hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic invisibility and cultural assumptions about what grandmothers could accomplish when everything depended on getting it right. The silence in the Riverside County Emergency Operations Center stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of collective defeat. 80 innocent lives hung in the balance while seasoned emergency professionals struggled to accept that their expertise had reached its limits. Chief Rodriguez's admission that the rescue mission exceeded their capabilities echoed through the room like a funeral bell. It was in that moment of absolute despair that Lourdes Cooper made the decision that would change everything. I can fly the mission. Her voice cut through the oppressive silence with quiet certainty. Those 5 simple words carrying more authority than all the technical briefings and weather reports that had preceded them. Every head in the operations center turned toward the elderly woman who had been sitting unobtrusively in the back of the room. Dismissed by most as a well-meaning civilian observer, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Captain Morrison's expression shifted from professional exhaustion to something approaching alarm as he processed what the 74-year-old grandmother had just proposed. Dr. Foster looked up from her weather charts with the startled confusion of someone whose understanding of reality had just been challenged. Ma'am, I don't think you understand the severity of the conditions we're dealing with, Morrison said, his voice carrying the patient concern reserved for elderly citizens who might be experiencing confusion during stressful situations. We're talking about flying through hurricane-force winds with zero visibility, where the most experienced emergency pilots in California have failed repeatedly. Chief Rodriguez stepped forward with the diplomatic authority of someone accustomed to managing well-intentioned civilians during crisis situations. His expression combined professional courtesy with the barely concealed frustration of a man who didn't have time for unrealistic suggestions when lives were measured in hours. Mrs. Cooper, we appreciate your willingness to help, but helicopter rescue operations in extreme weather require years of specialized training and current certifications that take decades to achieve, Rodriguez explained. What we're facing out there isn't something that civilian pilots encounter during normal flying operations. The dismissal was gentle but firm, and completely understandable given Lourdes's appearance and the bureaucratic assumptions that governed emergency response protocols. To everyone present, she looked exactly like what her cover identity suggested, a retired civilian pilot whose flying experience involved weekend, recreational trips rather than life-or-death missions through impossible conditions. Lourdes stood slowly, her arthritis requiring careful movement that reinforced the impression of physical limitations, inappropriate for demanding flight operations. But as she reached into her worn leather purse, something in her posture began to change, a subtle straightening that suggested hidden reserves of strength and confidence. "Gentlemen, before you dismiss my capabilities, perhaps you should examine my actual credentials rather than making assumptions based on appearances," she said quietly. Producing a set of documents that she had kept, sealed for over 3 decades. The first document was a military pilot's license that immediately caught Morrison's attention, not because of its authenticity, which was obvious, but because of classification. Levels that exceeded his security clearance. The license bore official seals and authorization codes that civilian emergency personnel rarely encountered outside of joint military operations. "Mrs. Cooper, this appears to be a classified military aviation license," Morrison said, his voice shifting from dismissal to cautious curiosity. "But the dates indicate service from the 1970s, which would have been during Vietnam," Lourdes completed, her voice carrying the weight of experiences that couldn't be documented in any civilian personnel file. Specifically, medical evacuation, operations in combat zones, where standard safety procedures would have resulted in casualties rather than successful rescues. The second document she produced created a silence so profound that the constant background chatter of radio communications seemed to disappear entirely. Flight Surgeon Hamilton was the first to recognize what he was looking at, and his reaction set the tone for everything that followed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hamilton announced, his voice barely above a whisper, "you are looking at the combat flight record of Colonel Lourdes Cooper, Calcine Angel 7, who logged over 3,200 medical evacuation flights during the Vietnam War." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Personnel who had been dealing with professional defeat suddenly found themselves in the presence of someone whose legendary status existed in military aviation circles, but was unknown to civilian emergency services. Chief Rodriguez approached Lourdes with the careful respect accorded to living legends whose achievements exceeded normal understanding. "Colonel Cooper, if these records are authentic, then you possess flight experience that goes far beyond anything our pilots have encountered." "The records are authentic, Chief Rodriguez," Lourdes replied, and for the first time since entering the operations center, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command responsibilities under extreme pressure. "What they don't show is that most of those evacuation flights were conducted under conditions that would be considered impossible by current civilian aviation standards." Captain Morrison stared at the documents with the expression of someone whose professional worldview was being fundamentally altered. The elderly woman he had been dismissing as a confused civilian was revealing herself to be one of the most accomplished combat pilots in aviation history. "Colonel Cooper, the conditions you faced in Vietnam, were they comparable to what we're dealing with now?" Morrison asked, his tone shifting to that of a student seeking instruction from a recognized master. Lourdes moved toward the weather displays with fluid confidence that belied her earlier appearance of physical limitation. Her analysis of the meteorological data was swift and precise, demonstrating familiarity with extreme weather flying that exceeded anything the civilian pilots had ever studied. "Captain Morrison, the thermal activity and wind shear patterns you're showing me are severe but manageable using techniques developed for combat operations in hostile environments," she explained. "The visibility problems can be overcome with instrument approaches that don't rely on visual references." and the mechanical stress on aircraft systems is within acceptable parameters if you understand how to work with the environmental conditions rather than fighting them. Dr. Foster looked up from her computer models with the fascination of someone watching theoretical limitations being challenged by practical experience. Colonel Cooper, according to our atmospheric analysis, the vertical air movements in the target area are exceeding 3,000 feet per minute. How can any aircraft maintain control in those conditions? Lourdes smiled with the confidence of someone who had solved similar problems when failure meant death for wounded soldiers depending on her skills. Dr. Foster, you use the thermal columns instead of avoiding them. Proper timing and approach angles can turn vertical air movements into tactical advantages that provide additional lift and reduced fuel consumption during critical phases of the mission. The explanation was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that everyone present began to understand they were listening to someone whose expertise operated on levels they hadn't previously imagined. The mission that had seemed impossible minutes earlier was being reframed as challenging but achievable by someone who possessed the right combination of skills and experience. Colonel Cooper, Chief Rodriguez said, his voice carrying newfound hope mixed with professional caution. Assuming you're willing to attempt this mission, what would you need from our support teams? The question marked a fundamental shift in the room's dynamics. The emergency response leadership was transitioning from dismissing Lourdes' offer to actively considering whether her unique qualifications might provide the solution that conventional approaches had failed to achieve. Chief Rodriguez, I'll need access to your most reliable aircraft. A crew chief who understands that we'll be operating beyond normal safety margins, and complete tactical control over mission planning and execution, Lourdes replied. Most importantly, I'll need everyone present to understand that the techniques I'll be using weren't developed for peacetime operations and may appear to violate established procedures. The conditions she outlined represented a complete departure from standard emergency response protocols, requiring civilian emergency services to trust military-style tactical aviation methods that existed outside their normal experience. Decision would require Chief Rodriguez to authorize procedures that could result in career-ending consequences if the mission failed. But as reports continued to arrive from Mountain View Care Center describing deteriorating medical conditions among the trapped residents, the choice became clear. Conventional approaches had failed completely, and time was running out for 80 innocent people whose only hope lay with someone whose capabilities exceeded everything that bureaucracy and assumptions had been willing to recognize. Colonel Cooper, Chief Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the weight of a command decision that would define careers and save lives. You have full operational authority for this rescue mission. What do you need to get started? The moment of truth had arrived. After decades of hidden expertise and bureaucratic invisibility, Lourdes Cooper was finally being recognized for what she had always been, one of the most accomplished combat pilots in aviation history, whose skills were exactly what the situation required when conventional wisdom proclaimed the mission impossible. The transformation from dismissed grandmother to respected military authority was complete. But the most difficult part lay ahead, proving that her confidence was justified by accomplishing a rescue mission that would test every technique she had learned during the most dangerous operations of her legendary career. The transformation of Lourdes Cooper from dismissed grandmother to operational commander was swift and absolute. Within minutes of receiving authorization from Chief Rodriguez, she had taken control of the Emergency Operations Center with the fluid efficiency of someone returning to familiar territory after a brief absence. Her decades of hidden expertise emerged like water breaking through a dam, flooding the room with tactical knowledge that civilian emergency services had never encountered. First priority is aircraft selection and configuration, Lourdes announced, moving toward the hangar status displays with purposeful strides that bore no resemblance to her earlier careful movements. I need detailed maintenance records for every available helicopter, fuel load calculations for extended operations, and weight distribution analysis for maximum passenger capacity. Flight mechanic Roberto Martinez, who had initially viewed Lourdes as a curious civilian observer, now found himself taking orders from someone whose technical requirements exceeded anything he had encountered during 15 years of emergency aviation maintenance. Her questions revealed understanding of aircraft systems that went far beyond normal pilot training. Colonel Cooper, our Bell 412 has the best power-to-weight ratio and payload capacity, Martinez reported, consulting specifications that suddenly seemed inadequate for the mission parameters she was outlining. But the configuration is optimized for normal emergency operations, not the extreme conditions you're planning to encounter. Lourdes examined the aircraft specifications with the practiced eye of someone who had once modified helicopters for combat operations using equipment that wasn't supposed to exist according to official procurement records. Her assessment was swift and precise, identifying capabilities and limitations that would determine mission success or failure. Mr. Martinez, I need the cabin stripped of all non-essential equipment to maximize passenger capacity, she instructed. Remove medical equipment that won't be needed during transport. Eliminate passenger comfort features and configure seating for maximum occupancy rather than normal safety margins. The modifications she was requesting violated numerous civilian aviation regulations designed to ensure passenger safety during normal operations. But as Martinez processed her instructions, he began to understand that normal operations had no relevance to a mission that conventional wisdom declared impossible. Captain Morrison approached with a crew roster that had been hastily assembled from volunteers who understood they were signing up for the most dangerous flight operation in California emergency aviation history. His expression reflected the particular anxiety that comes with recommending people for missions that could easily result in casualties among the rescuers as well as the rescued. Colonel Cooper, I've identified our most experienced crew members for the mission, Morrison reported. Co-pilot Jennifer Walsh has over 2,000 flight hours in extreme weather conditions, and flight engineer Mark Stevens specializes in emergency systems management under stress. Lourdes reviewed the personnel files with approval that was tempered by realistic assessment of what the mission would require from everyone involved. Her crew briefing would need to prepare civilian emergency personnel for tactical aviation, techniques that weren't taught in any civilian training program. Captain Morrison, your crew selection is excellent, but I need everyone to understand that we'll be operating using methods that may seem to violate everything they've been trained to do, she explained. Success will require abandoning normal safety protocols in favor of combat aviation techniques that accept calculated risks to achieve mission objectives. The pre-flight briefing that followed was unlike anything the assembled personnel had ever experienced. Lourdes outlined approach patterns that used terrain features to provide protection from wind shear, navigation techniques that relied on instrument references when visibility dropped to zero, and emergency procedures that prioritized mission completion over crew safety according to civilian standards. The thermal columns that have been defeating your rescue attempts can actually provide tactical advantages if approached correctly, Lourdes explained to a room of experienced pilots who were learning that their understanding of extreme weather flying had significant limitations. Proper timing allows you to use vertical air movements for additional lift during critical phases of flight, reducing fuel consumption and mechanical stress on aircraft systems. Co-pilot Walsh raised her hand with the tentative curiosity of someone whose professional training was being expanded in directions she hadn't known existed. Colonel Cooper, the approach pattern you're describing seems to violate minimum altitude requirements for operations in restricted visibility conditions. Ms. Walsh, minimum altitude requirements are peacetime luxuries that become irrelevant when people are dying because pilots won't risk flying low enough to complete their missions. Lourdes replied with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone whose combat experience had proven that regulations were suggestions rather than absolute limitations. The weather briefing provided by Dr. Foster painted a picture of atmospheric conditions that remained extreme, but were being reframed as tactical challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. Lourdes' analysis of the meteorological data revealed opportunities that civilian emergency pilots had been trained to avoid. Current wind patterns show gusts up to 95 miles per hour, but the direction changes follow predictable cycles based on terrain features, Dr. Foster reported. Colonel Cooper, how do you plan to navigate through wind shear that could overwhelm aircraft control systems? Lourdes moved to the topographical display that dominated one wall of the operations center, tracing approach routes with the confidence of someone who had flown similar missions, when failure meant death for wounded soldiers depending on her skills. Dr. Foster, wind shear becomes manageable when you stop fighting it and start using it, she explained. The key is timing your approach to coincide with wind patterns that provide tailwind assistance during descent and crosswind protection. During the final approach phase, Flight Engineer Stevens studied the mission parameters with growing amazement as he processed tactical aviation, concepts that existed nowhere in civilian training curricula. His experience with emergency systems management was extensive, but Lourdes was describing operational techniques that pushed aircraft beyond normal performance envelopes. Colonel Cooper, the stress loads you're describing would exceed manufacturer recommendations for safe operations, Stevens observed. How do we maintain aircraft integrity while operating outside established parameters? Mr. Stevens, manufacturer. Recommendations are based on civilian liability concerns rather than actual aircraft capabilities, Lourdes replied. Military operations routinely exceed those parameters because the aircraft are designed to handle stresses that lawyers won't allow manufacturers to acknowledge. The equipment modifications proceeded with urgency, driven by medical reports from Mountain View Care Center that confirmed the deteriorating situation inside the trapped facility. Facility Administrator Carol Jenkins provided updates that made every minute of preparation time precious beyond calculation. Oxygen levels continue to drop due to smoke infiltration, and we now have 6 residents in critical respiratory distress. Jenkins reported through radio communications that crackled with static from the electromagnetic interference created by the massive fire. Medical staff estimate that we have less than 4 hours before we start losing people to smoke-related complications. The timeline that had seemed impossibly short became even more desperate as medical realities combined with equipment preparation requirements to create pressure that tested everyone's ability to function under extreme stress. Every modification to the helicopter, every briefing session, every equipment check was measured against the lives that hung in the balance. Chief Rodriguez monitored the preparation activities with the expression of someone whose career depended on a mission that conventional wisdom said couldn't succeed. His decision to authorize Lourdes' unconventional approach represented a calculated gamble that could result in disaster if her confidence proved to be misplaced. Colonel Cooper, what's your realistic assessment of mission success probability? Rodriguez asked during a brief pause in the frantic preparation activities. Lourdes paused in her equipment inspection to consider a question that required honest evaluation of factors that could easily result in aircraft loss and crew casualties. Her answer reflected the kind of calculated risk assessment that had kept her alive during hundreds of combat missions. Chief Rodriguez, under normal circumstances, with conventional approaches, mission success probability would be near 0, she replied. Using techniques developed for combat operations in extreme conditions, I estimate success probability at approximately 70%. The assessment was sobering but represented hope where none had existed before. 70% success probability meant 30% chance of failure that could result in additional casualties among the rescue team. But it also meant the best chance that 80 innocent people had of surviving a disaster that exceeded every conventional response capability. As the final preparations neared completion, Lourdes conducted a personal equipment check that revealed items no civilian pilot would carry during normal emergency operations. Her flight suit contained navigation aids developed for combat operations, communication equipment that could function in electronic warfare environments, and emergency survival gear designed for hostile territory operations. The moment of departure was approaching rapidly, and with it the ultimate test of whether 5 decades of hidden expertise could overcome environmental conditions that had defeated every conventional rescue attempt. The mission that had been declared impossible was about to begin, guided by someone whose qualifications exceeded everything that bureaucracy and assumptions had been willing to recognize. But first, there was one final communication that needed to be made: a radio call to the trapped residents at Mountain View Care Center, informing them that help was finally coming in the form of a 74-year-old grandmother whose true identity was about to transform their hopeless situation into the most extraordinary rescue operation in California emergency aviation history. Modified Bell 412 helicopter sat on the tarmac like a mechanical predator preparing for battle, its stripped interior and reconfigured systems representing the marriage of civilian emergency aviation with combat-tested tactical modifications. Lourdes Cooper conducted her final pre-flight inspection with movements that had become fluid and precise, her arthritis forgotten in the focus that came from returning to work. She had been born to do. The morning air was thick with smoke and ash that reduced visibility to less than half a mile even at ground level, while weather reports confirmed that conditions in the target area had deteriorated beyond anything in recorded California fire history. Wind speeds were fluctuating between 70 and 110 miles per hour, with thermal activity that created vertical air movements exceeding 4,000 feet per minute. Angel 7, this is Riverside Emergency Control, came the voice of Captain Morrison through the aircraft communication system. You are cleared for departure when ready. Current weather conditions in the target area remain extreme, with zero visibility and winds exceeding safe operational parameters for all other aircraft in the region. Lourdes settled into the pilot's seat with the comfortable familiarity of someone returning home after a long absence. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with automatic precision, conducting system checks that incorporated both standard civilian procedures and military-style verification protocols that her crew had never witnessed. Riverside Control, Angel 7 ready for departure, she responded, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once provided confidence to wounded soldiers who depended on her skills for survival. Requesting direct routing to Mountain View Care Center. Flight time approximately 22 minutes under current conditions. Co-pilot Jennifer Walsh occupied the right seat with an expression that combined professional excitement with understandable nervousness about flying with someone whose techniques existed outside normal training parameters. Her extensive experience with extreme weather operations was about to be expanded in directions she hadn't known were possible. Colonel Cooper, all systems are green and passenger cabin is configured for maximum capacity, Walsh reported. Flight engineer Stevens confirms we're operating at gross weight limits, but within acceptable parameters for the modified configuration. The takeoff proceeded despite conditions that had grounded every other aircraft in Southern California, with Lourdes demonstrating why her Vietnam War service had earned legendary status among military aviators. She used crosswind patterns that civilian pilots were trained to avoid, finding stable air currents within the chaotic atmospheric conditions that other pilots couldn't detect. Riverside Control, Angel 7 airborne and proceeding toward target area, Lourdes reported as the helicopter climbed through smoke layers that reduced visibility to instrument-only navigation. Initial conditions confirm tactical approach will be required for successful landing zone access. The landing approach that followed demonstrated why Lourdes had earned her legendary reputation during medical evacuation operations in Southeast Asia. She used ridgelines to break wind patterns, thermal columns to provide lift during critical descent phases, and navigation techniques that relied entirely on instrument references when visual flight became impossible. Walsh gripped her armrests as the helicopter descended through conditions that should have resulted in immediate loss of aircraft control. But Lourdes's technique was so precise that the aircraft maintained stable flight characteristics despite atmospheric chaos that resembled flying through a tornado. "I can see the facility emergency lights," Stevens reported as the helicopter broke through the worst smoke layer at 200 feet above ground level. "Landing zone appears clear, but wind indicators show gusts exceeding 90 miles per hour with constant direction changes." The final approach to Mountain View Care Center required split-second timing and tactical flying skills that existed nowhere in civilian training programs. Lourdes used momentary lulls in wind patterns to position the helicopter for landing, compensating for gusts that would have overwhelmed normal control inputs, through techniques developed during combat operations where failure meant death. "Angel 7 touching down at Mountain View Care Center," she reported as the helicopter settled onto the facility's small landing pad with precision that amazed everyone monitoring the mission. "Landing zone secure, beginning passenger loading operations immediately." The scene that greeted them at Mountain View was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Facility staff had organized the 80 residents into groups prioritized by medical urgency, with the most critical patients prepared for immediate evacuation. Despite the terrifying conditions outside, the residents displayed remarkable courage as they prepared to trust their lives to a rescue operation that everyone understood was their only hope for survival. Facility Administrator Carol Jenkins met the helicopter crew with relief that bordered on euphoria, her professional composure barely containing emotions that had been building during 3 days of hopeless waiting for rescue. That conventional wisdom said couldn't happen. "Colonel Cooper, we have 14 residents requiring immediate medical evacuation and 66 others who can manage standard transport," Jenkins reported, shouting to be heard over rotor noise and wind conditions that made normal conversation impossible. "Medical staff has prepared everyone for immediate loading according to your capacity requirements." The passenger loading proceeded with military efficiency despite conditions that challenged everyone's ability to function safely. Smoke density required everyone to wear protective breathing equipment, while wind gusts created constant danger of people being knocked down or blown away from the aircraft. Lourdes monitored the loading process while maintaining power settings that kept the helicopter stable against wind forces that would have moved an uncontrolled aircraft hundreds of feet in seconds. Her tactical aviation experience provided the precise power management needed to maintain position while passengers climbed aboard. First group loaded, 28 passengers secured for transport, Stevens reported as the initial evacuation group was strapped into the modified cabin configuration. "Weight and balance within acceptable parameters, ready for departure when you are, Colonel." The return flight would test Lourdes's skills even more severely than the approach, as the added weight and passenger safety concerns required modified flight techniques that balanced mission success against the responsibility of protecting innocent civilians who had placed their complete trust in her abilities. Riverside Control, Angel 7 departing Mountain View with first passenger group, Lourdes reported as the heavily loaded helicopter lifted off into conditions that resembled flying through hell itself. Estimated arrival time 25 minutes. Requesting medical teams standing by for immediate patient transfer. The rescue mission that conventional wisdom had declared impossible was succeeding. But the most dangerous phase lay ahead, navigating back through extreme weather conditions while protecting passengers whose survival depended entirely on the combat aviation skills of a 74-year-old grandmother, whom everyone had initially dismissed as just another concerned civilian. The return flight from Mountain View Care Center tested every aspect of Lourdes Cooper's legendary piloting skills as the heavily loaded Bell 412 helicopter carved through atmospheric conditions that had worsened significantly during the 20 minutes required for passenger loading. Wind patterns had shifted as the fire continued to expand, creating new thermal columns and downdraft zones that required constant tactical adjustments to maintain safe flight. 28 elderly residents sat strapped into the modified cabin configuration, their faces reflecting a mixture of terror and hope as they experienced the most dangerous flight of their lives. Many had never been in a helicopter under normal conditions, let alone during a rescue operation that pushed both aircraft and pilot beyond normal operational limits. Angel 7, this is Riverside Control, came Captain Morrison's voice through increasingly static-filled communications. Weather reports show continued deterioration in your flight path. Are you able to maintain course and airspeed under current conditions? Lourdes adjusted her flight parameters to compensate for wind shear that would have been impossible for civilian emergency pilots to navigate successfully. Her combat-tested techniques allowed her to use the chaotic atmospheric conditions as navigation aids rather than obstacles, finding stable air currents within the turbulence that other pilots couldn't detect. Riverside Control, Angel 7 maintaining course with tactical modifications for current weather patterns, she replied, her voice carrying calm professionalism that provided confidence to ground control personnel who were monitoring what everyone understood was an extraordinary aviation achievement. Passenger cabin secure, all systems nominal, estimated arrival in 18 minutes. Co-pilot Walsh watched with growing amazement as Lourdes demonstrated flight techniques that seemed to violate fundamental laws of aerodynamics. The helicopter maintained stable flight characteristics despite carrying maximum passenger load through conditions that should have resulted in immediate loss of aircraft control. Colonel Cooper, the flight path you're using doesn't match any approach corridor I've ever studied, Walsh observed. How are you finding stable air through these thermal patterns? Ms. Walsh, combat flying teaches you to read atmospheric conditions that civilian training doesn't cover, Lourdes explained while executing a descending turn that used a downdraft to reduce power requirements during a critical phase of the flight. You learn to see opportunities where other pilots see only obstacles. Flight engineer Stevens monitored aircraft systems that were performing beyond manufacturer specifications, but remained within the extended operational envelopes that military aviation routinely required. His understanding of helicopter maintenance was being revolutionized by watching someone push civilian equipment, using techniques that existed outside normal training parameters. All systems continue to perform within acceptable ranges despite extreme operating conditions, Stevens reported. Engine temperatures are elevated but stable, and passenger cabin environmental controls are maintaining adequate conditions despite external smoke infiltration. The landing at Riverside County Emergency Medical Center proceeded with precision that amazed ground personnel who had been preparing for a disaster that conventional wisdom said couldn't be avoided. Medical teams stood ready to receive patients whose survival had depended entirely on aviation skills that exceeded everything civilian emergency services had previously encountered. Riverside Medical, Angel 7 on final approach with 28 passengers requiring immediate medical evaluation, Lourdes reported as the helicopter settled onto the designated landing pad. Priority patients include 6 requiring respiratory support and 3 with cardiac complications related to smoke exposure. The passenger transfer proceeded with military efficiency as medical teams, who had been skeptical of the rescue mission's feasibility, found themselves receiving elderly residents whose rescue had been accomplished through flight techniques that existed outside their understanding of emergency aviation capabilities. Dr. Richard Hamilton supervised the medical evaluation process with professional amazement that reflected his growing recognition of what he had just witnessed. The successful completion of a mission that his military experience had suggested was impossible represented a fundamental expansion of his understanding of aviation capabilities under extreme conditions. Colonel Cooper, the successful evacuation of this first group represents an extraordinary achievement. Dr. Hamilton commented as medical teams began treating patients whose survival had required aviation skills of legendary proportions. How many additional trips will be required to complete the full evacuation? Lourdes consulted passenger manifests and aircraft performance calculations while Flight Engineer Stevens conducted rapid maintenance checks that would determine whether the helicopter could sustain the additional missions required to rescue the remaining 52 residents trapped at Mountain View Care Center. Dr. Hamilton will need 3 additional flights to complete the evacuation, she replied. Aircraft systems are performing well within acceptable parameters, and weather conditions remain challenging, but manageable using tactical aviation techniques. The preparation for the second rescue flight proceeded with urgency driven by medical reports from Mountain View that confirmed the deteriorating situation inside the facility. Smoke infiltration had worsened significantly, and facility medical staff reported increasing numbers of residents experiencing respiratory distress that required immediate evacuation. Angel 7, this is Mountain View Medical Control, came the voice of Dr. Patricia Collins, through radio communications that were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain due to electromagnetic interference from the massive fire. We now have 11 residents in critical respiratory distress, and oxygen supplies are nearly exhausted. How quickly can you return for the next evacuation group? The timeline that had seemed manageable during mission planning was being compressed by medical emergencies that made every minute of preparation time precious beyond calculation. The fire's continued expansion was also creating new atmospheric hazards that required tactical modifications to flight plans that had worked successfully during the initial rescue. Mountain View Medical, Angel 7 departing for second evacuation. Flight in approximately 8 minutes, Lourdes replied. Prepare next passenger group according to medical priority. Maximum capacity 26 residents for this flight. The second departure took place under conditions that had deteriorated even further, with wind speeds now fluctuating between 85 and 120 miles per hour and smoke density that reduced visibility to less than 100 feet even at ground level. The fire had also expanded to within 800 meters of Mountain View's perimeter, creating thermal activity that exceeded anything recorded in California fire history. Rodriguez monitored the mission progress from the Emergency Operations Center with the expression of someone whose understanding of aviation capabilities was being fundamentally altered by what he was witnessing. The rescue operation that his most experienced pilots had declared impossible was succeeding because of expertise that existed outside normal emergency service parameters. Colonel Cooper's second flight is proceeding according to tactical flight plan, reported Dr. Foster, who was providing real-time weather analysis that confirmed the extraordinary nature of what was being accomplished. Current atmospheric conditions would ground military aircraft operating under normal safety protocols. The approach to Mountain View for the second evacuation required even more sophisticated tactical flying as wind patterns had shifted and intensified. Lourdes used terrain features that provided momentary protection from wind shear, while navigating through thermal columns that created vertical air movements exceeding 5,000 feet per minute. Angel 7 beginning second approach to Mountain View landing zone, she reported while executing descent patterns that used ridgelines and thermal activity to maintain aircraft control through conditions that resembled flying through multiple tornadoes simultaneously. Visibility remains 0, but tactical navigation is proceeding successfully. The second landing demonstrated why Lourdes had earned legendary status during medical evacuation operations in Vietnam. She positioned the helicopter with precision that seemed impossible under the current conditions, using momentary lulls and wind patterns to achieve stable landing configuration despite atmospheric chaos that exceeded anything in her previous experience. The passenger loading for the second group proceeded even more rapidly as facility staff had refined their procedures based on the first successful evacuation. 26 additional residents were loaded and secured within 12 minutes, including several requiring medical support that challenged the aircraft's life support capabilities. Second passenger group loaded and secured, Stevens reported. Weight and balance within acceptable parameters. Medical patients stable for transport. Ready for departure when conditions permit. But as Lourdes prepared for the second return flight, weather reports confirmed what everyone had begun to fear: atmospheric conditions were continuing to deteriorate beyond even her extraordinary capabilities to manage safely. The fire's expansion was creating new thermal patterns that made tactical navigation increasingly dangerous. Riverside Control, Angel 7 requesting updated weather analysis for return flight, she reported. Thermal activity appears to be intensifying beyond previous parameters. Dr. Foster's response confirmed the growing challenges that would test Lourdes' skills beyond anything she had encountered during her legendary military career. The atmospheric conditions were approaching levels that might exceed even combat-tested aviation techniques. Angel 7. Current weather analysis shows thermal activity exceeding 6,000 feet per minute vertical movement, with wind shear patterns that are becoming unpredictable, Dr. Foster reported. Conditions are approaching the theoretical limits for helicopter operations under any circumstances. The second return flight would test whether Lourdes' extraordinary skills could overcome environmental conditions that were pushing beyond the boundaries of what any aircraft could handle safely, while protecting innocent civilians whose survival depended entirely on her ability to accomplish what physics suggested might be impossible. The third approach to Mountain View Care Center would test the absolute limits of what aviation physics could endure. Weather conditions had deteriorated to levels that meteorologists were calling unprecedented, with thermal columns now generating vertical air movements exceeding 7,000 feet per minute and wind shear patterns that defied every predictive model. In Dr. Foster's computer systems, Lourdes Cooper gripped the flight controls with hands that showed the slight tremor of 74-year-old arthritis. But her mind remained razor-sharp as she navigated through atmospheric chaos that resembled flying through the center of a hurricane combined with a volcanic eruption. 26 more residents awaited rescue, and time was running out as the fire's leading edge approached within 400 meters of the facility. Angel 7, this is Mountain View Emergency Control, came Dr. Collins's increasingly desperate voice through radio communications that were breaking up due to electromagnetic interference from the massive fire. We have 8 residents in critical respiratory failure and facility structural integrity is compromised by extreme heat. This may be our last opportunity for evacuation. The weight of that statement settled over everyone monitoring the mission. If this flight failed, 26 innocent people would die because environmental conditions had finally exceeded even Lourdes' extraordinary capabilities. The rescue operation that had succeeded beyond all expectations was approaching the moment when physics might trump expertise. Mountain View Control, Angel 7 proceeding with third evacuation approach, Lourdes replied, her voice maintaining the calm professionalism that had characterized her entire military career, even as she navigated through conditions that challenged every technique she had learned during 3,200 combat missions. Estimated arrival in 14 minutes. Prepare final passenger group for immediate loading. Co-pilot Walsh monitored flight instruments that showed aircraft systems operating at the absolute edge of their design parameters. Engine temperatures were approaching redline levels due to the extreme atmospheric conditions, and structural stress indicators showed loadings that exceeded normal certification standards. Colonel Cooper, Engine temperatures are climbing into yellow zones, and structural stress is approaching maximum rated levels, Walsh reported, her voice reflecting professional concern about operating an aircraft under conditions that manufacturer engineers had never anticipated. Are we exceeding safe operational limits? Ms. Walsh, safe operational limits are peacetime concepts that become irrelevant when people are dying, Lourdes replied while executing a descending spiral that used multiple thermal columns to maintain aircraft control through wind shear that would have destroyed any helicopter flown by conventional techniques. The aircraft can handle more stress than the lawyers will admit. Flight engineer Stevens watched engine parameters that fluctuated wildly as the helicopter encountered atmospheric conditions that created thermal shock effects on mechanical systems. His 15 years of emergency aviation maintenance had never prepared him for monitoring equipment that was being pushed to limits that existed outside normal operational experience. All systems continuing to function despite extreme environmental conditions, Stevens reported. Engine performance is stable within extended operational parameters, though we're definitely operating outside normal civilian aviation safety margins. The approach to Mountain View for the third time required navigation techniques that Lourdes had developed during the most dangerous medical evacuations of her Vietnam service. She used ridgelines to break wind patterns while riding thermal columns that provided lift during critical descent phases, all while maintaining precise heading control through atmospheric turbulence that resembled flying through a blender. The landing pad at Mountain View Care Center was now surrounded by walls of flame on 3 sides, with the fire's heat creating thermal effects that made the helicopter's approach corridor a tunnel of superheated air filled with ash particles that sandblasted the aircraft windscreen and reduced visibility to absolute zero. Angel 7 on final approach to Mountain View, Lourdes reported as she guided the helicopter through the most dangerous landing of her legendary career. Visibility 0, thermal activity extreme, but approach proceeding according to tactical flight plan. The scene that greeted them at Mountain View was heartbreaking in its desperation. Facility staff had positioned the final 26 residents as close to the landing pad as safety permitted, with medical personnel providing respiratory support to 8 critically ill patients who might not survive the flight back to medical facilities. Facility Administrator Jenkins met the helicopter crew with emotions barely under control as she realized that this extraordinary rescue operation was actually going to succeed in saving every resident, despite conditions that conventional wisdom had declared unsurvivable. Colonel Cooper, these are our final 26 residents, including 8 requiring immediate life support during transport, Jenkins shouted over rotor noise and wind conditions that made normal communication impossible. I don't know how to thank you for what you've accomplished here today. The passenger loading proceeded with desperate urgency as flames approached the facility's main building and structural components began failing due to extreme heat exposure. Smoke density required everyone to wear breathing equipment, while wind gusts created constant danger of people being swept away from the aircraft. Lourdes maintained precise power settings that kept the helicopter stable against wind forces that were now approaching 130 miles per hour, with thermal activity that created vertical air movements capable of lifting or slamming aircraft with devastating force. Her tactical aviation experience provided the exact control inputs needed to maintain position while protecting passengers climbing aboard. Final group loaded, 26 passengers secured including 8 requiring medical support. Stevens reported as the last resident was strapped into the modified cabin configuration. Weight and balance at maximum acceptable limits, ready for departure immediately. But as Lourdes prepared for the final departure, weather conditions reached levels that challenged even her extraordinary capabilities. The fire had created a thermal chimney effect that was generating atmospheric conditions unlike anything recorded in aviation history, with vertical air movements exceeding 8,000 feet per minute. and wind patterns that changed direction every few seconds. Riverside Control, Angel 7 departing Mountain View with final passenger group, she reported as the heavily loaded helicopter lifted off from a landing pad that was beginning to burn around the edges. Conditions are extreme beyond all previous parameters, but aircraft is responding to tactical control inputs. The final flight back to Riverside County Medical Center required every technique that Lourdes had learned during 5 decades of flying in impossible conditions. She used thermal columns that other pilots would have avoided, rode downdrafts that provided controlled descent through chaotic wind patterns, and navigated by instruments through visibility that had dropped to less than 50 feet. 26 elderly residents experienced the flight of their lives as Lourdes demonstrated why her Vietnam War service had earned legendary status among military aviators worldwide. Despite carrying maximum passenger load through atmospheric conditions that resembled flying through hell itself, she maintained aircraft control with precision that seemed to defy physical laws. Angel 7, this is Riverside Control, came Captain Morrison's voice through communications that were barely audible due to electromagnetic interference. Weather radar shows conditions in your flight path that exceed measurement capabilities. Can you maintain controlled flight under current circumstances? Riverside Control, Angel 7 maintaining controlled flight using tactical aviation techniques. Lourdes replied, her voice carrying the calm confidence that had once provided hope to wounded soldiers who depended on her skills for survival. Aircraft performance within acceptable parameters, passengers secure, estimated arrival in 16 minutes. The landing at Riverside County Medical Center was greeted by emergency personnel, whose professional skepticism had been completely replaced by amazed respect for what they had witnessed. Medical teams stood ready to receive patients whose rescue had required aviation capabilities that exceeded everything civilian emergency services had previously understood to be possible. Riverside Medical, Angel 7 on final approach with final passenger group, Lourdes reported as the helicopter settled onto the landing pad with precision that culminated one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in aviation history. All Mountain View Care Center residents successfully evacuated, mission complete. The silence that followed was profound and emotional as everyone present processed what had just been accomplished. 80 elderly residents had been rescued from certain death by a 74-year-old grandmother whose true capabilities had been hidden beneath bureaucratic assumptions and cultural limitations until the moment when her expertise became the difference between life and death. Dr. Hamilton supervised the medical evaluation of the final passenger group with professional amazement that reflected his complete revision of understanding about aviation capabilities under extreme conditions. The successful completion of a mission that military analysis had suggested was impossible represented a fundamental expansion of what emergency services could accomplish. Colonel Cooper, you've just completed what may be the most extraordinary rescue operation in aviation history, Dr. Hamilton commented as medical teams began treating patients whose survival had required skills that existed at the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. How do we even begin to document what you've accomplished here today? Lourdes climbed down from the helicopter with careful movements that reminded everyone that arthritis and age were realities that couldn't be completely overcome by determination and skill. But her expression carried the satisfaction of someone who had proven that expertise transcends every limitation except the willingness to recognize it when lives depend on getting it right. Dr. Hamilton, documented as a successful emergency evacuation conducted using tactical aviation techniques, she replied with characteristic humility. The specific methods used are less important than the result. 80 people went home to their families today. As news reports began documenting the rescue operation that had seemed impossible, Lourdes Cooper quietly returned to her modest apartment at Sunset Gardens Assisted Living Community. To casual observers, she looked exactly like any other elderly resident settling in for an evening of television and quiet reflection. but for those who had witnessed her extraordinary demonstration of aviation mastery under impossible conditions. She would forever be remembered as the 74-year-old grandmother whose Vietnam War combat experience had saved 80 lives when conventional wisdom proclaimed the mission couldn't be done. The legend of Angel 7 lived on, proving that true expertise recognizes no limitations except those imposed by the willingness to let it emerge, when everything depends on accomplishing the impossible. Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment when their unique gifts become exactly what the situation requires to transform hopeless tragedy into miraculous salvation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.